an exceptional advocate for Lynch Syndrome. So, Dawn, come on up.
PowerPoint presentation, so just my story. My name is Dawn Kornfeld. First, I want to thank St. Vincent's for inviting me here tonight to speak to all of you and to tell my story about what it's actually like to live with one of these genetic mutations. I have Lynch Syndrome. Tomorrow is actually National Provivers Day, and if you don't know what a proviver is, don't worry, because I didn't either until I was diagnosed with Lynch Syndrome. Well, someone who beats cancer, everyone knows, is called survivor. And if a provider would be someone who is surviving the predisposition to cancer, but actually hasn't had cancer yet. So I've never had cancer. But people were like, well, what do we call ourselves? Because we're likely to get cancer. So previvor became a label that they used to describe people like me. But honestly, just the name Lynch Syndrome, I know it's named after Dr. Henry Lynch, who's the one who kind of found the mutation, but the name Lynch kind of sounds like a lynching. And so you might wonder if having it is a death sentence. And I think I felt that way at first, before I really understood what my diagnosis meant. But now I feel lucky because I feel like I have some insider information. I can't say that learning that there was a mutation in my family was a shock. I think I've lived my whole life with sort of a grim expectation that I'd probably get cancer, and I think most of my relatives felt the same way. But first, let me tell you a little bit about my family and how we eventually discovered our Lynch syndrome mutation. Well, some people can look at their family tree and see a relative or two that had cancer. My tree is filled with cancers, lots and lots of cancers. My great-grandfather, William, died of cancer in his 70s, and we know that it had metastasized through his body. He had 6 children. 4 of them went on to fight cancer. His daughters, Edith and Sadie, both had colon cancer and died in their 60s. His only son, Lou, passed from pancreatic cancer at 70, and another daughter, my grandmother, Anne, battled cancer 5 times, including uterine, bladder, ureter, liver, and breast cancer. She got her first cancer in her late 30s, where they initially gave her 6 months to live, but she's a tough cookie, she was. She had her last cancer at 80 years old, and she died at 86, not from cancer, believe it or not. While Lou's 2 children never got cancer, the family curse, which is what it was called for many years, was passed down to William's daughter's children. Edith's 3 children all got cancer. One son died from pancreatic cancer, another son died from bladder cancer, and her daughter is a colon cancer survivor. She's still alive. And one of her 2 grandchildren is a cancer survivor. She was diagnosed with both uterine and breast cancer in her 40s. And Sadie's 2 adult children were also affected. Her son survived colon cancer twice, the first time at the age of 25, and second time in his 50s. And her daughter had uterine cancer in her 40s and kidney cancer, which killed her in her 60s. And so far, Sadie's grandchildren are cancer-free. My grandma, Anne, who seemed to have the most cancers in the family, had 3 children. Her youngest, my Aunt Nancy, beat ovarian cancer in her 30s and breast cancer a few years later, but ultimately she succumbed to a very aggressive colon cancer at the age of 61. A couple of years before she had colon cancer, my Aunt Nancy actually decided to become a participant in a genetic study that looked at families with cancer histories, and she was initially tested for the BRCA mutation. Makes sense? Ovarian cancer, mother had uterine cancer. Her results were negative, and she was relieved. And at the time, there was no discussion of Lynch syndrome. It was 2004, and Lynch syndrome awareness was still in a very infantile stage. When she passed away in 2007, her tumor was screened for abnormalities. The results had showed there was an extreme likelihood that Lynch syndrome ran in our family, but in order to prove it, 1 living cancer survivor, just 1, in the family needed to be tested as well. And my cousin Jillian, her daughter, approached several of the survivors in the family and asked them to be tested. And they all told her that they didn't think it applied to them. And even if it did, they didn't want to know and refused to be tested. One of those who turned down my cousin was my father, Jay. He had surgery to remove a ureter cancer tumor a few years earlier, in 2004, at the age of 67, and even though his mother had the same cancer and his baby sister had just died of cancer, he just didn't think his cancer was related to theirs because he wasn't a young man, and it was ureter, colon. 4 years after my dad's ureter cancer, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. Was it Lynch related? No one knows, but it's possible. He assumed it was just age-related since he was 71 years old. And 3 years after that, in 2011, my father was diagnosed with ureter cancer again. And my father was surprised, and his urologist was very surprised, to say the least, because it's not very common for someone to get it once, let alone again, and it was a completely unrelated cancer. First time it was on his left side, now it's on his right side. And even though his doctor was aware that his mother had the same cancer, and that cancer in general was very prevalent in the family, there were no red flags raised because his doctor was simply uninformed about Lynch syndrome. And this time around, the cancer was more aggressive, and he needed surgery, and they had to remove the entire ureter and the kidney. 3 months later, in early 2012, my father was back in the hospital, back in St. Vincent's, and this time he had stomach cancer, not related to the ureter. He was recovering from the ureter, and he got stomach cancer. My youngest son, Dylan, was taking a biology class, actually, at the time that my father was in the hospital, and he was studying a unit on genetics, which piqued his curiosity, and one morning he had asked me, which doctors deal with genetics? And I don't know anything about genetics, and I told him I didn't have a clue. But while I was visiting my dad in the hospital, I spoke to his surgeon, Dr. Marcus, who's the head of St. Vincent's. He was my dad's surgeon, and I asked him Dylan's question. We were just talking about the surgery in general, what was going to happen, and I said, what can you tell me about genetics? And he said, oh, well, oncology is something your son might want to look into. Let me give you a couple of brochures you can give to your son. One was on the BRCA mutation, and one was on Lynch syndrome, and I took them and I shoved them in my purse, like most of us would do. And later that night, my dad had fallen asleep. I was sitting upstairs on the 10th floor, and I do what anybody else does when they're killing time in a hospital room waiting for someone to wake up. You look for something to read. So I opened my bag and I pulled out the brochures. And then I started reading about Lynch syndrome. And I remember sitting up in my chair and going, oh my God, this list of cancers. These are my cancers. This is my family. And I called my cousin on the phone and I said, hey, you remember when your mom's tumor was diagnosed? You said there was something they thought our family might have. Do you remember what it was called? And she confirmed it was Lynch syndrome. She said, you know, I asked your dad to get tested back then, but he said no. I said, yeah, well, we're going to ask him again. And sure enough, I spoke with Dr. Marcus the next morning. I told him about our family tree, and he absolutely agreed that my father should get tested. And not surprising, my dad didn't want to get tested. He said, I don't need to know. But I said, it's not for you. It's for me. It's for my brother. It's for your 4 grandsons. They need to know. And so, in late January 2012, my father had his entire stomach removed, and he was diagnosed with Lynch syndrome. My brother and I and my father's surviving sister were all tested next, and his surviving sister had gotten breast cancer much later, in her late 60s. So she was really nervous. My brother had some stomach issues. He was nervous. I wasn't so nervous. My brother and aunt were both tested negative, and I came back as a positive match. And that was in March of 2012, and life has definitely changed a lot for me since then. As I said earlier, when I first found out I had Lynch syndrome, I felt like I was given a death sentence. I mean, I cried a lot. To hear that your own body is basically working against you is scary enough, and the fear got worse when you watch loved ones suffer. And even worse is the fear that I might have passed this along to my kids, my bloodline. Soon after, I wiped my tears, I ended my pity party, and I listened. I started to learn more about the genetic mutation, and I came to understand that it's not a disease, it's a predictor of disease. It's based on a genetic flaw that basically prevents my body from detecting and killing cancer cells, which is pretty scary. Then I listened to the doctors and the genetic specialists and the amazing Lynch syndrome support groups, and I learned that if my body can't detect cancer as well as most people's, I'm simply going to have doctors check me a lot more often. And that's when I realized that this diagnosis was a gift. It's the gift of knowledge. I already feared cancer. finally, the family curse that had haunted me for my entire life was not a mystery. You know, perhaps I will be the first member of my family that can stack the deck in my favor. The first thing I did was to assemble a great team of doctors. And I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that every single one of my doctors was well-versed in Lynch syndrome. A few of them were. Dr. Spivak, my gastroenterologist, was. Dr. Messhouse, my breast specialist, was. Dr. Van Cott here was my father's, one of my father's surgeons on his team. But not all of them. My primary care physician didn't know anything about Lynch syndrome. I met a urologist, didn't know anything about Lynch syndrome. But my criteria when choosing a specialist was really simple. They had to be willing to learn about Lynch syndrome, and they had to be willing to be my advocate. And that was my criteria. So I switched one primary doctor for another, and got my staff together. So I have a genetic counselor, I have dermatologists, and I have an amazing support staff here at St. Vincent's. And it seems like a lot of doctors, that it is, but the good thing is that if I stay healthy, I only have to see them once or twice a year. I don't love you, but... When I was first diagnosed with Lynch syndrome, my husband Mark and I sat down with Joanna, who's in the back, and she's in the oncology department, and we reviewed the recommended screenings. And one of the things strongly recommended to me, which you've heard about earlier, was a prophylactic total hysterectomy and oophorectomy, which would eliminate the high risk of getting ovarian and uterine cancer. And because I already had children, it seemed like a no-brainer to my husband. But still, I was 44 years old and healthy. And I wasn't anywhere close to menopause. So the thought of having this surgery was pretty tough to deal with. But at the end of the day, the thought of getting uterine or ovarian cancer, especially because they told me we can't really detect ovarian cancer very well, and I knew it was in the family, that seemed a little scarier than this surgery. So I opted for the surgery, and that was it. But I remember meeting with my gynecologist first, and no one in my practice. They delivered my children, I loved them, I trusted them. No one had ever heard of Lynch syndrome. But they did their research. They found out about it, and they scheduled the surgery for me in the spring of 2012. But before then, I met with all the other doctors, because if I'm going under once, let's make sure that there's nothing else to look for. So I had the colonoscopy, I had the endoscopy, CAT scans, breast MRIs, you name it. I said, screen away, we're going in, let's just, so they did. And thankfully, everything was clear. So I recovered from the surgery. It was pretty easy because everything was healthy, there were no problems, which was great. I did endure the onslaught of full-blown menopause. We call it surgical menopause, just means it's not slow, just right in there. It was rough. The first 6 months were pretty ugly, especially for my 2 teenage sons to have to deal with a very emotional mom. But I've been symptom-free for most of this year, so it was about 6 months of pretty awful symptoms, and then I'm fine now, thank goodness. But I've been surviving cancer for the last 19 months, and so what's it like living with Lynch syndrome now? I try to schedule all my appointments around March or April. I give myself kind of a 6-week window to kind of worry, be nervous. It's also kind of the anniversary of when I found out, so I try not to, spread it out. You just get them all done at the same time, and then, then it's over. Then I don't have to worry about it. I am going to get colonoscopies every year for the rest of my life. How are they really? The prep's unpleasant. Get a pile of magazines, move it into your bathroom, call it the library for that day. It's unpleasant. But the procedure itself, I sleep through the whole thing. Don't feel a thing, don't know anything, wake up, I'm ready to go home. That's it. So the thought of getting colon cancer, a lot worse than the colonoscopy, I promise you. And as for other screenings, some are annual, some every other year, and I'd like to think that the odds are more in my favor these days because I'm getting screened as often as I am. And if for some reason a cancer sneaks in, and it might, I'm confident that my doctors are going to catch it early. And that's why I do all the screenings that I do. So it is a gift of knowledge that I was given, and when someone asks me why I got tested, that's what I tell them. I tell them the truth, that when it comes to cancer, I don't want to play fair. I want to stack the deck in my favor, and I plan on beating any cancer that might kind of come my way. As for my dad, he sadly passed away this January after getting liver cancer. And Lynch cancers are a little more aggressive than most cancers. They tend to develop a lot faster, and he had his health compromised from other things, and he just couldn't fight back. But I promised him that I would try to live a healthier life and stay on top of all my screenings, and when possible, I would help other people try to avoid the same fate of their own family curses. So when it comes to Lynch syndrome, this is what I know. Having it is a fight. It's a fight against cancer. It's not much of a fair fight. It's more like a street fight with a whole bunch of people you don't know that can sneak up on you. But I look at my doctors as my comrades that are going to kind of be on my side to fight them off. And that is a big help. It's also a fight for awareness in the community. I think we need more doctors to know about it. We need more patients to know about it. We don't have Angelina Jolie, not her. But I have you. And when you learn about it and you tell people about it, that's how people know. And when I say that I want doctors to know about it, I don't mean that, oh yeah, I've heard of Lynch syndrome. Really, what is it? Oh, well, I've heard of it. No. We need our doctors to really understand what it is, what to look for, and how to help their patients. And sometimes it's a fight even within our own families. I think about all those survivors in my family who said no to testing, including my dad. What if he had said yes in 2007? Surely they would have detected his second ureter cancer before it was so advanced that it affected his kidney as well. I imagine his stomach cancer would have been detected before it reached stage 3. There are cancer survivors in my family tree who still do not want to get tested, even though they have young children, much younger than me, who are certainly at risk. But they want to stick their heads in the sand like ostriches, and they hope if they ignore it, then it won't happen. And that's unfortunate, because it could happen. For the last year, I have been a patient advocate and have tried to educate doctors, nurses, and patients about Lynch syndrome. 95% of people who are carrying the Lynch syndrome mutation have no idea they're at risk. According to the Lynch Syndrome International's latest statistics, at least 600,000 and upwards of 1 million people have Lynch syndrome. 5% no. That's it. 5% no, and everybody else has no clue. They have family curses. And I'm proud to say that since my dad and I were diagnosed, a lot of our doctors are now discussing it. St. Vincent's has posters about it. I've seen it. I've gone into my gynecologist's office where they didn't know about it. Now it's on their questionnaire, not just about BRCA, but about colon cancer, about uterine cancer, which is amazing to me. And they tell me it's because they're learning and they're trying. So look, when you go to your doctors and they ask you to fill out those patient questionnaires, see if they're even asking. And if they're not asking, you might want to mention, how come you're not asking? I have 2 amazing teenage sons, and both of them will get tested after their 18th birthdays. And I hope and pray that both of them will get negative test results. However, I know the odds are 50-50, so do they. It's a coin toss. And if one or both of them do have Lynch syndrome, I will tell them what I'm telling all of you this evening. Knowledge is power. Having a genetic mutation does not mean you will get cancer. It just means the odds are a little worse for you. Most people who get cancer, though, do not have genetic mutations, and they never see it coming. But if you know you have a genetic mutation, it means your doctors are always looking for cancer. So their exams are longer, and they're more thorough. And if they do find cancer, the odds are favorable that they're going to catch it early, and they're going to cure it. So I choose to face Lynch syndrome with my head held high, ready to fight if I have to. And with increased awareness, I hope more people can learn how to stack the decks in their favor too. Thank you.